We are now up to part 19 in our story of Disney artist Herb Ryman. We've followed him through his childhood, through his time at MGM and Fox, also at the Disney studio, where he worked in the layout and background departments. And more recently, we watched as Ryman helped Walt develop and open Disneyland. Now we're up to the late 1950s, when Walt needed to both expand Disneyland and also develop attractions of greater mechanical and technological sophistication. Today we'll move through the late 1950s as Disneyland evolves from an experimental amusement park to part of the cultural landscape of Southern California. In this today, we have a few little-known stories about Walt, also stories of how Ryman continued to struggle with his artistic ambitions in the world of Hollywood, where collaborative projects were often more valuable than work produced by an individual. And so, if you're ready, let's go. In the late 1950s, WED was Walt Disney's refuge from troubles at the studio, from the runaway budgets and creative battles of Sleeping Beauty, from the endless employees associated with live-action film production, and from the demands of producing not one series for TV, but 3. By October 1957, Disney had 3 shows on ABC. The weekly offerings of the Disneyland Anthology, an hour-long show on Wednesdays, Zorro, a half-hour adventure series on Thursdays, and The Mickey Mouse Club, a half-hour variety show for younger viewers presented 5 afternoons a week. With the studio producing hundreds of hours of entertainment each year, production areas devoted to film and TV were an endless mass of directors, technicians, actors, and various assistants. But Walt felt at home around the designers of WED, a far smaller group focused on the emerging field of theme park design, a group that included Herbie as one of its lead artists. Though at one time the members of Herbie's family had all lived in Illinois, by the late 1950s, they were now in California. Herbie lived with his mother in Sherman Oaks, though she regularly returned to Illinois to visit friends. His sister, Lucille, had been an executive talent scout and was in an on-again, off-again marriage with lead actor John Carroll. His other sister, Christine, had been the director of nutrition for the state of Illinois, and in 1957, became a food and kitchen consultant to the Disney studios to make recommendations about studio meals. She was also interested in restaurant management in Los Angeles. In this, all members of Herbie's family were somehow connected, if only tangentially, to Hollywood. The closeness of his family, particularly that of his mother, soothed the wounds of his early years. The largest of those tragedies, of course, had been the death of his father on the battlefield. Another such tragedy occurred when Irving Thalberg had died, a loss that sent MGM, a studio that Ryman had once adored, into a period of managerial disarray. The problems there had been so significant that Ryman temporarily sought refuge in teaching. Much to his surprise, Walt's amusement park now brought a new sense of stability to his life. Nearly everyone who worked for WED was astonished by both the level of design work required to continually refresh the park and also by how much they enjoyed it. Though WED artists were rarely acknowledged as designers of Disneyland, they could each see how the public responded to their work. On the days they toured the park, they saw families enjoying lands and attractions they had helped create. Walt encouraged his artists to focus on what they gave the public, how much their designs were appreciated by the millions who visited the park. In this, WED artists understood the trade-off. Their work for Disney was appreciated by a far larger audience than any work they produced in their free time. By the end of 1957, after the park's first 2.5 years, more than 10 million people had visited Disneyland, whereas during that same period, maybe a few thousand admired one of Herbie's circus paintings. The problem for Herbie was that none of his work at WED pointed back to him. With studio work, illustrators could reasonably assume that they would eventually rise to the ranks and have their name featured on screen, perhaps as an art director. At WED, artists rose in salary, but never in notoriety. The only name presented at the park was that of Walt, leaving other artists in the shadows as invisible masters. Some WED artists, such as John Hench and Claude Coates, accepted this trade, as it gave their work a tremendous audience, even if that audience would never know who had designed the castle or the lovely dark rides in Fantasyland. Their designs were highly visible, perhaps more visible than 99% of artists working in America. But as individuals, they remained invisible, carefully tucked behind the velvet curtain of fantasy. This arrangement did not sit well with Ryman, as he still wanted an audience to not only acknowledge his work, but also to acknowledge him. Still, he loved his assignments at WED, the act of completing them with originality and purpose. His primary job was to translate Walt's ideas, which were often expressed with words or small drawings, into detailed illustrations or paintings. He had a gift to take Walt's amorphous dreams and visually present them with specificity. Herbie was often the first artist to whom Walt turned when he was ready to visually conceptualize a new project. In ways, Ryman was indispensable. He should have felt great security, but the insecurity of his earlier years, the loss of his father and later of Thalberg, shadowed him, as life experience had taught him that even stable situations could quickly become undone. During these years, to Walt he repeatedly explained that he didn't want to be tied to a contract so that he might keep his options open in case work at WED no longer interested him. This argument was based on Ryman's experience at the Disney studio in the 1940s. During the last 2 years of the war, he had lost interest in the type of low-budget educational shorts Disney was financially forced to create. But there was more to it than this. Though publicly Herbie pointed to those low-cost educational films as the reason he refused the contract, he desired freedom for other ends as well. Every year or two, he needed to prove to himself that his artistic skills had value outside of his current job. He took on some assignments, such as illustration work for books and magazines, likely to enjoy a small dose of public notoriety. But he took on other projects, it seems largely to convince himself of his worth outside of WED. One of these projects was Freedomland, a theme park designed by Marco Engineering for New York in the late 1950s. Ryman only moonlighted for them in the evenings, creating concept paintings. Freedomland featured themed areas that were extremely similar to those at Disneyland, including a turn-of-the-century entrance street called Little Old New York, a futuristic land called Satellite City, and a western outpost called the Old Southwest. It was a knockoff park, Disneyland without the Disney name, with just enough variation in its designs to keep Marco Engineering out of court, but also with enough similarities to interest people who lived in or near New York. Ryman worked on selected areas, which ensured that the visual framing of these lands would be similar to the framing style used at Disneyland. Herbie's work, albeit brief for Marco Engineering, wasn't about money. He was extremely well paid at WED. It was tied to a more troubling need, the desire to convince himself that his skills, unique as they were valued outside of the company started by Walt. He may have also wanted to convince himself that his social circle, which was largely tied to Disney, could be reconstructed elsewhere if need be. Despite these forays outside of Walt's kingdom, Disney remained the center of his life. He painted concept pieces for dozens of proposed expansion areas and attractions at Disneyland, but his work wasn't limited to the park. When the studio needed a prop painting, he created that too. In 1958, he painted a canvas featured in the film The Shaggy Dog, a painting that featured Lucrezia Borgia and her sheepdog, an image that depicted how humans, under the spell of a ring, could turn into an animal. This was the exact type of work he had done back in the 1930s at MGM. It was also one of the few times where his work now was seen directly by the public, with the eyes of the audience looking at the painting his brush had created, rather than a themed building loosely inspired by an illustration he had once drawn. Despite brief forays back into motion picture production, Ryman was most at home in the short hallways and scattered offices of WED. He fell into its social environment. His office was not far from other sketch artists, art directors, and architects who once designed live-action sets at Fox and MGM. Once more, he was in a comfortable gathering of peers, artists who, for years, had lived just below the credited role of art director at other studios, but now were focused on the fantasies Walt wanted to develop for his park. By this point, Disneyland was well known across the country, largely because of segments filmed at the park for both Walt's Wednesday night TV show and the Mickey Mouse Club. But the park as a business was a regional attraction. It drew nearly all of its visitors from Southern California, which meant that it continually needed new attractions to spur repeat visitation from local residents. For these projects, Ryman worked with old friends such as Dick Irvine, Marvin Davis, and Bill Martin. It was a comfortable life, a gathering of artists who had spent most of their careers at larger studios. Despite his streaks of artistic independence, Ryman remained close with Walt. Though Walt knew about Ryman's published illustrations, he likely never knew about Ryman's experience with Freedomland. Almost surely, Herbie was able to mentally justify work on these outside projects because of his status as a non-contract employee. He had never signed that piece of paper, which he saw both as a guarantee of employment and as a type of loyalty oath. Without it, he could work where he chose. But clearly, Ryman must have sensed that there was more simmering beneath his decision than a need for money. His life at times was a set of contradictions. He needed stability, yet he pursued projects that had the potential to disrupt the stability he found at WED. He needed an audience for his art, yet he couldn't fully embrace the collaborative culture of Hollywood in which artists disappeared behind the title of a film or the marquee at a theme park. Outside of work, he had a rich social life. Friends at WED recalled that Ryman often had a girlfriend or at least a date for various parties, yet these flirtations or affairs never developed into serious long-term relationships. Perhaps because many of his encounters were platonic, he wasn't particularly careful whom he asked to accompany him on various activities. He was simply popular around the lot, including with young women. At the end of July 1958, Ryman spent time with Cecilia Burrows, the wife of a studio stuntman, Bob Burrows, a man with a rodeo past who now rode horses in westerns. Ryman described these meetings as innocent lunch outings, but after her husband learned that they were meeting for a meal, he drove over to Ryman's house, forced him into a car at gunpoint. Once seated, Burrows said, "You're about as close to death as you'll ever be." The encounter ended with a scuffle, Ryman a slender individual battling a stuntman for his freedom. The police eventually took Burrows into custody. Ryman himself was taken to Sun Valley Hospital, where overnight he was checked for injuries and a concussion. The following day, Ryman was visited by family. He was also visited by a few friends, including Walt Disney. That day, August 1st, was an important day for Walt. In the evening, he was being honored at the Hollywood Bowl with a musical presentation that showcased his 35 years in film production. The presentation would include the cast of the Zorro TV series, a line of Mouseketeers, the Disneyland Band, 7 international dance troupes, and the Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra. The event required Walt to arrive early, but Walt still found time to visit Ryman. The Hollywood Bowl was south of the studio, a trip that could easily take 15 minutes in late afternoon traffic, and Ryman's hospital was north of the studio, a trip that could easily take 20 minutes each way. Even though Walt had a pressing engagement, he left work early enough to drive up to Sun Valley to sit next to Ryman's bed before he retraced his journey battling traffic south to spend the evening at the Hollywood Bowl. In many ways, this trip revealed the depths of Walt's connection to Ryman. Though most of Walt's personal relationships revolved around his work, Ryman was also outside of that. He was a friend, someone who Walt valued far beyond the activities of WED. When Ryman returned to work, he was allowed to relax and recover. His one large assignment that fall was to create a bird's-eye painting of a new area that Walt wanted to develop at Disneyland. For years, Walt had believed that Tomorrowland was less developed and certainly had fewer big attractions than other areas of the park, such as Frontierland or Fantasyland. Walt now wanted to include a Matterhorn-themed roller coaster, a submarine journey, an experimental monorail, a revamped Autopia course, and a revised Skyway at his park. Ryman again was asked to create an illustration, this time a painting, in which he integrated all of these unbuilt wonders into a seamless vision, just as he had with the original Disneyland map. This time, though, the goal wasn't to persuade network executives and bankers to invest in the park. Rather, it was to build public interest in the project. Ryman's painting was focused primarily on the Matterhorn, a magnificent white peak rising up out of the middle of the park. Submarines arranged in their lagoon were offset from the water by a curved white wake. A monorail glided along a beam. In the background, the edge of the park was elegantly framed in by a line of tall trees. At the top of the image, Ryman added a slogan, "More magic in the Magic Kingdom." For the next year, visitors to Disneyland would see this image posted outside of construction barriers, an image that artfully defined how Walt was now changing his park. With these new rides, Walt was beginning to transform Disneyland's identity into something beyond a set of cinematic adventures and a set of proposed historical areas. These new attractions would not only increase the sophistication of rides found at Disneyland, they would expand the variety of experiences represented in the park. The Matterhorn would be the first modern roller coaster with a tubular steel track. Submarine Voyage would be an underseas version of both the Jungle Cruise and the Mine Train, where guests encountered mechanical representations of wildlife. Most significantly, the monorail would be an example of near-future transportation, a sleek train designed to ease traffic congestion in growing cities. Walt collectively referred to the opening of these attractions as the second opening of Disneyland, as it not only expanded the footprint of the park, but also expanded its purpose. At the studio, Walt had finally taken the hint about introducing Ryman as the man who traveled with the circus. He still mentioned his circus adventures, but he was more likely to introduce Ryman in some other way. Walt tended to say, "This is my artist friend, Herbert." But as Walt was often drawn to light sarcasm and ribbing, he was rarely able to let praise exist by itself without undercutting it with humor. After he made the introduction, according to Ryman, Walt would proudly show the visitors something I was working on. Then he'd say, "And sometimes he's practical." Ryman understood that Walt's teasing was in part to create a work environment where no one, despite their talent, took themselves too seriously. It was always in good sport, Ryman added. But he also knew the ribbing moved only in one direction. "I was never allowed to tease Walt," he explained, "because he took the superior position and he could tease you, but you were not supposed to tease him. Also, he could tell you a joke, but that didn't mean you could turn around and tell him one. He didn't have time for your joke." Like most artists at WED, Herbie understood that Walt's direct praise was nearly impossible to obtain unless it was followed by a joke. "He never said that's beautiful or that's wonderful," Ryman explained. The best one might get was, "That's okay," which Ryman thought was one hell of a compliment to get from Walt. As such, Ryman looked for other ways to convince himself that Walt appreciated his work. "If Walt failed to frown at you," Herbie once confided, "that meant it was okay." Walt's lack of open approval, though Ryman perhaps never realized this, provided deep motivation for many WED artists as they endlessly refined their work in the hopes of finally receiving a kind word from their boss. As a result, Ryman decided that he would take it on himself to inject WED with a stronger focus on public praise. His first target, of course, was Walt, perhaps with the belief that if Walt received open compliments, he would be more likely to return the gesture to other artists. During these months, Walt received many honors, most of which were not deeply discussed at WED. In November 1958, Walt was appointed the Pageantry Committee Chairman for the 1960 Winter Olympics. At about the same time, President Dwight Eisenhower named him to the President's Committee on Education to explore learning opportunities for adults beyond high school. After Walt returned from a trip to London, where he received an award, Ryman thought that he would help initiate change at the studio by pointing out Walt's achievement. "We were very proud," Ryman later explained. "I've forgotten the name of the film that opened at that time, but I met Walt alone in the hallway and I thought, gee, I better say something. He came right toward me, a silhouette, and I said, 'Walt, we were very proud of the honors that you received in England, and it must have been a wonderful thing.'" Walt stood there, unsure what to say, his forehead wrinkled in confusion. "Oh, Herbie," he responded, "that's in the past. We've got work to do. Don't talk about that." Then he walked away. Ryman watched him move down the hall. He was in his late 50s and walked a little slower than he had in recent years. But this was not what Ryman primarily noticed. Ryman observed how Walt was unable to accept genuine praise when it was directed at him, as though accepting compliments might make him less ambitious. He was a little embarrassed, Ryman concluded. After that, Ryman never again attempted to initiate open praise into the culture of WED and simply accepted that one of the reasons that WED was so successful was that everyone, including Walt, worked to gain the admiration of others. As long as that admiration was withheld, everyone would continue to work with single-minded determination, often completing projects that they initially thought beyond their abilities. Despite this, the late 1950s and early 1960s was another period of closeness between Ryman and Walt, a period where Herbie understood how Walt, as he moved beyond middle age, continued to change. "I see Walt Disney's magic as being a very simple thing," Ryman said. "I think the fact that he remained a child, and that as an adult he remained a boy, and all of his life, as long as he lived, he maintained continual extraordinary enthusiastic curiosity, a curiosity for everything combined with a tremendous respect for people and for animals. He loved animals, he loved life, he loved nature." Ryman saw Walt, who was now a grandfather, as a sophisticated adult who had never been forced to give up the joys of being young. For Ryman, this was most apparent when they visited Disneyland, trips that were primarily arranged to explore possible expansions and improvements to increase revenue. Often, however, Walt wanted to sneak back to the pony farm in the hopes of catching the man who oversaw it, Owen Pope, resting. Owen and his wife Dolly were the only people who lived at Disneyland. They had a small house out behind Frontierland next to the stables. They remained on site to take care of the animals. Pope was extremely hardworking, not only in managing the horses, but hand-making their tack, and even building stagecoaches. Walt wondered at how diligently the man worked, and so as a game, he hoped that one day he would venture out to the stable to find Pope relaxing. "Many times we'd go back," Ryman said, "and Walt would think, 'I'm going to sneak up on Owen while he's having a nap or something.'" Owen Pope, however, was always outside caring for the horses or fixing stable fences. But one day, as Walt and Ryman ventured to the stables, they didn't find Owen Pope outside, nor in his house. At this, Walt grew excited, believing they would finally catch the man resting. But much to Walt's dismay, they saw the door open to the tack room. We walked inside, and there was Owen stitching some beautiful leather harness, putting the gorgeous brass buckles on them. Walt talked with him for a while, then walked off with an air of disappointment back along a dirt path that led to Frontierland. "I failed again," Walt said. "I keep going back there. I want to catch that guy asleep." Ryman only nodded his head, but later when Walt wasn't with him, he took Pope aside to make sure he understood the situation. "You know why he comes back here," Ryman said. "He wants to catch you asleep." Pope dipped his head in acknowledgement, then gave Ryman a little wink before leaning in to whisper, "He doesn't come at the right time." Other times while visiting Disneyland, Ryman was impressed with Walt's business acumen, how he had memorized every last detail of the park. He knew where all the electrical pipes were under the ground, Ryman said. He knew where the sewers were. He was the only one in many instances who knew where the boxes were that were under the asphalt paving. The engineers didn't know. He knew because he loved that. This was his little castle. This was his own dream. More significantly, Walt was able to convey his love of the park to others, to people he met in person, and to those watching him on TV. "He could just look at that camera and smile," Ryman said, "and you thought he's going to say something very, very wonderful, and he did, and it was all so smooth, and that came from a genuine affection and rapport with people." One afternoon, Walt asked Herbie to join him in a projection room to watch a work print of a nature documentary, a film that would be released as part of the True Life Adventures series. For a while, Ryman had been confused as to why Walt, an animation producer, was releasing a series of fanciful documentary films about animals to theaters. Once the picture was over, Walt wanted to know what Ryman thought about the film and about the series in general. "You've got a great crusading capability for an educational series of films that's out of this world," Ryman said. Then he asked why Walt didn't simply release these pictures as educational projects without the stories, light animation, and cinematic music. Walt looked off at the screen, which was now an empty rectangle, before allowing his gaze to settle back on Ryman. He took in a breath, then explained one of the central realities of his life. "I can't release films as being educational films," he said. "The educators will look at my record and find out that I never graduated from high school. They'll kill me. I gotta find a way to release them as entertainment. If they find out they're also educational, then that's all right." With this, Ryman could again see into another aspect of Walt's life. Walt had a unique brilliance, a natural curiosity combined with an ability to intuit the desires of Middle America. But moreover, he had the ability to understand those around him. It seemed, at least to some at WED, that Walt knew that the world of classic Hollywood was slowly coming to an end. The American audience wasn't particularly interested in lavish productions anymore, such as A Tale of Two Cities or The Good Earth. They were now drawn to realistic stories that took place in contemporary worlds that they recognized. Films like Psycho, Some Like It Hot, and Rebel Without a Cause. In terms of design work, all these films required were stock sets that resembled a suburban house, a modern high school, and a neighborhood police station. But the history of Hollywood, even as the last rays of its golden age were beginning to fade, had been rebuilt, commemorated, and celebrated at Disneyland. Much of Disneyland was arranged to look back over the history of American filmmaking, while other sections, such as Tomorrowland, now gazed off at the future of the American city. In Herbie's life, there had only been a few men who had successfully created a meaningful community. The first had been his father, who died when Herbie was young. The next were Irving Thalberg and Cedric Gibbons, who for a decade created an arts community at MGM. After the MGM community fell apart, Ryman mostly looked to himself to arrange his life as he saw fit. He went on trips, he spent time with his family, he had strong relationships with people he had worked with at various studios. But now, as he approached the age of 50, he found himself falling once more into one of these communities, one that was again created by a successful older man. The community of WED, its endless projects and ambitions, was an extension of Walt. If there had been no Walt, there could be no WED. Walt was the person who made this space exist. Walt seemed to know that artists such as Ryman needed a community, a place where their skills were valued, a place that pushed them toward greater accomplishments. WED was exactly what Ryman, a middle-aged bachelor, needed, a place where he felt at home working for a person who perhaps looked the other way each time Herbie felt the need to assert his independence, creating illustrations for novels, designing plans for a fisherman's village, and even creating a few pieces of unsigned art used to create an imitation Disneyland on the other side of the country. It was more than Ryman had the right to expect at this point in his life, but also he was grateful to be there. Among those that Walt had personally, perhaps unknowingly, saved from live-action studios, whose lovely backlots were slowly falling into a state of decline as the city moved forward from the golden age of Hollywood to new experiences that existed in the years ahead. I'll be back next week with a new episode. As we're moving now into October, next week we'll have our monthly news and analysis discussion about the Disney Company. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney Company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes. But the best reason to join is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can become a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.